Councillors, 2-minute warning. The council meeting will start on time at 4:30. A 2-minute warning. Please gather yourselves, find your seat. We'll be starting shortly.
Councillors, I'll just take the opportunity to introduce Susan Prater, our new Manager of Economy and Growth. I'm pretty sure most of you would already know Susan, but welcome to the team, Susan.
Welcome, Susan.
Well, councillors, executive team, and those joining us in the gallery and online, I'd like to welcome you to our ordinary meeting of council for the month of August. As councillors are aware, the ordinary, extraordinary and committee open meetings of council are now broadcast live on the internet. The system has been optimised for speaking approximately 1 foot away from microphones. Speaking too close will distort your voice, and speaking too far away will make it difficult to hear. We have received positive feedback to date, and we hope to continue improving the quality of the broadcast to increase the numbers of listeners. Now, I may ask to or remind councillors, when you speak, please turn your microphone on. When you're finished speaking, please turn the microphone off. I'd now like to acknowledge the Kamilaroi people as the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather, and pay my respects to elders both past and present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal community members who may be present or listening in online. I may now ask, please, all be upstanding for prayer. Eternal God, our loving Father, we come to thee this day in the name of Jesus Christ, who is the lover of our souls and the saviour of all mankind. May we feel his love and respond to it. May his spirit shine in lives that are darkened by worry, doubt or fear. Strengthen and guide those who are trying to do what is right. Make it plain to them. Make us more mindful of the needs of our fellow men and less absorbed in selfish concerns, that Christ may approve and bless what we do here this day. We ask these blessings in his name. Amen. Please be seated. Well, councillors and council team and friends listening in, and also those with us in the gallery, we now come to the bereavements in our community between the 21st of July and the 21st, and today the 24th of August. And we mourn the loss of William James Riley, Kevin Allen Smith, Larry Neville Thurston, Patricia Joan Masman, Barry Roy Knox McKean, Frederick John Williams, Glenda Dawn Dudley, Peter Charles Traynor, Philip Bauer, Bryn Fritz and Colin Morrison. Again, councillors and those in the chambers, if I can please ask that you be upstanding for 1 minute silence as we extend our condolences to the family and friends of the deceased. Thank you. Please be seated. We'll now move on to those present and any apologies we may have received for our meeting. As you see on the screen, councillors, all councillors are in attendance and Councillor McGrath is in attendance but joining us virtually for our council meeting. And also our executive team are in attendance, fully in attendance. So there are no requirements for any leave of absence for the August ordinary meeting. So we'll move on now to a confirmation of previous minutes in relation to ordinary meeting held on Wednesday, the 20th of July. And I'll call for elected member to move that the minutes be a true and accurate record. Thank you, Councillor MacArthur, and seconded by Councillor Moses. Is there any debate, any questions, councillors, before I put this motion? Therefore, I'll put the motion. All in favour? Against? Declare the motion carried. Now move on to declarations of interest. And we have received 2 declarations and I'll read those to you and then call for any further declarations in relation to the business paper. The first is from Councillor Hook in relation to item 12.3, a request for fee waiver riding for the disabled. It's a less than significant non-pecuniary, and the reason is that Councillor Hook's wife is the honorary secretary. Councillor Hook, will you be remaining in the chambers for debate and determination?
No, I'll be leaving the chambers. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Our next declaration is from Councillor MacArthur in relation to item 11.6, which is application to modify consent 2013-134.003, alteration to proposed staging of works. It's a significant non-pecuniary declaration, and the reason is the applicant is brother-in-law, and Councillor MacArthur has stated that she will leave the chambers for the discussion and determination. So, councillors, that's the 2 received. I'll now call for any further declarations in relation to the business paper. Second call, third and final call. No further declarations. Thank you. We'll move on. Next is item 7, which is the community presentations. There are no community presentations, nor are there any Merrill minutes in item 8. Next, we have general manager's reports. Before I ask Mr. Groth to detail these reports, he has tabled a late general manager's report to close council. So as normal procedure, I'll now ask for an elected member to move that be accepted and be added to the last item on our agenda. Thank you. Councillor Hook has moved and is seconded by Councillor MacArthur. I'll now put that motion. All in favour? Against? Declare that motion carried. So that will now become the last item in closed council. So first item and the only item in the minutes of the ordinary meeting for our general manager is item 9.1, 2022 local government annual conference motions. I'll hand over to Mr. Groth to detail the recommendation.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Good evening, all. This is to enable council to consider those motions which it may wish to submit to the 2022 local government annual conference. Council has workshopped a number of motions already, and for council to determine those which those ones which it wishes to take forward.
Thank you, Mr. Groth. So council, as you'll see in your business paper, there are 6 items or 6 motions as put forward. So I'll now call for a mover of the recommendation. Become a motion.
Mr. Mayor, I have an additional motion which I'd like to submit.
Okay, can you explain that? And then I'll call for a seconder, please.
That LG New South Wales call on ALGA to make representation to the federal government to conduct a review into the Local Government Financial Assistance Grants Act 1995 and the basis on which the grant funding for roads is allocated to create a more equitable approach to allocations and one that recognises the infrastructure managed by local government in rural, regional and remote areas of Australia.
Thank you, councillor Hook. Now, there are 6 motions, so this would become motion 7.
Motion 7.
Okay, so I'll now call for a seconder to that motion. Councillor Hoddle is seconding. Councillor Hook has moved. Councillor Hook, as a mover of the motion, do you wish to speak?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Look, I've circulated the arguments to this particular motion to other councillors, but for the sake of people who may be listening online and those in the gallery, the objectives is in New South Wales, the primary function of the New South Wales Local Government Grants Commission is to make recommendations for the allocation of FAGs to the New South Wales Minister for Local Government. Local government financial assistance grants are generally purpose grants paid to local councils under the provision of the Federal Local Government Act 1995. The legislation details how the total amount of FAGs is determined and how the funds are to be distributed between the states, including the ACT and the Northern Territory. The New South Wales Local Government Grants Commission has been reported on the financial assistance grants allocation methodology reviews since 2012. The Productivity Commission and the Independent Local Government Review Panel found there is an increasing inequity between the sparsely populated, more remote and rural areas and metropolitan, more densely populated areas. Generally, remote councils have greater relative need due to the inherent factors, which is being compounded by depopulation. In New South Wales, a shift in population has been trending from the west of the divide towards the eastern seaboard. This has resulted in long-term population decline in many rural and remote council areas. Therefore, such councils have a diminished capacity to raise revenue while retaining responsibility for infrastructure and services, often including large local road networks in the area. They are also vulnerable to the impact of drought, flood and bushfires, further disadvantages which all amount to a greater relative disadvantage or need due to factors beyond the council's control. The Commission and local government in the Namoi recommend that a new approach model to allocating the FAGs is sought, that any revised model should include consideration of 1, genuine cost drivers, 2, allocating a higher proportion of grant funding to councils with the greatest relative need, 3 is robust, statistically verifiable and auditable, 4, using best practice financial modelling principles, and 5 is transparent and publishable. I'd certainly like this to be included as item 7. Thank you. And the other motions have already been circulated to the public. Thank you.
Before we progress any further, the actual motion as it sits at the moment that we have moved and seconded is not very descriptive of what would be going forward to conference. So can I suggest the mover and seconder consider the wording as you see on the screen. It talks about and determine those in which to submit to the conference. So if it's all 6, and with the addition of this 7th one, maybe some more detailed wording might be appropriate.
Mr Mayor, if I may suggest to the mover and seconder some wording, it may be that council wishes to submit those motions detailed in the report to conference as item 1, and item 2 simply read as submitted by councillor Hook, if that's the mind of council.
I'd certainly be happy to endorse that. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
So we'll just have that wording put on the screen, and then I'll ask councillor Hoddle to also confirm that he's happy with the wording as the seconder of the motion. So firstly, I'll go back to councillor Hook. The wording on the motion on the screen. Are you happy with that wording and continue to be the mover of the motion?
Yes, I think that's exactly how I submitted that motion. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
And as the seconder of the motion, councillor Hoddle, are you
Yeah, happy with
the
that,
wording?
Mr Mayor. Thank you.
So I'll now call on an elected member who'd like to speak against this motion or ask a question to now do so.
Can I ask a quick question?
You may.
I can't see the screen. Could someone just read out what the wording is?
The motion reads, are we going to share the screen?
Thank you.
Can you confirm that you can read that now, councillor McGrath?
Yes, I can read that. Thank you.
If there are no questions or a councillor to speak against,
I have
councillor
a
McCullough?
question, Mr Mayor. I'm just asking for a bit more specifics around the motion because my understanding is, through you, Mr Mayor, that there are already national principles based on federal legislation around small and declining populations, limited capacity to raise revenue, financial responsibility, relative isolation to skew the way the funding is provided. So are you wanting to, I'm not quite sure what more you want to achieve than what's already there. Thank you.
I don't know that what is already there is actually strong enough. You can see by the argument that I put in front of you that the financial assistance grants allocation methodology review has been going on since 2012, and the Productivity Commission itself has indicated that things need to be changed and improved. I can see nothing except benefit in taking this motion forward to strengthen any argument that there might possibly be in providing more equitable funding for remote regional and rural areas.
Councillor Hoddle, as the seconder of the motion, do you wish to speak?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. And I think it's a very well worded motion. We have the most complaints as a councillor I get are obviously on dirt roads, and I constantly get them. So in our local government area, we have a problem with trying to keep up the standard of the roads, especially during these wet times. But as you move further western state, there's less population and there's an enormous amount of roads to maintain. I think Councillor Hook made the point that the sort of the present system's favouring around the metropolitan areas of outer metropolitan areas of Sydney and Newcastle Wollongong. So we have to make sure that this is equitably distributed to the regional and remote areas of Australia that need it most. Thank you.
And I call for any further questions or elected member to speak against the motion. And being none, I'll now put this motion. All in favour? Against? Declare that motion carried. Thank you, Mr. Groth, for your contribution. We'll now move on to Director of Corporate and Community Services reports, and I'll call on Ms. Stidworthy to begin with her first item on the agenda, which is 2021-22 Operational and Capital Works Program carry forwards. Thank you, Ms. Stidworthy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, councillors. The 21-22 Operational Plan and Capital Works Program carry forwards report details the proposed budget amendments that relate to projects that are not yet finalised in the 2021-22 financial year. So as a result of that, the report recommends that council amend the approved budget in the 2022-23 financial year to recognise the unspent budgets relating to these projects. Acceptance of the recommendation of the budgets associated with the projects outlined in the attachment to the report will result in approximately $37 million of capital expenditure being added to the 2022-23 budget that supports the capital works program for council.
Thank you. I'll now call for elected member. Thank you. Councillor Luke has moved that recommendation to become a motion and seconded by Councillor Fuller. Councillor Luke has moved the motion. Do you wish to speak to it?
No, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
I'll now call for elected member who'd like to speak against the motion or ask a question. Being none, Councillor Fuller is the second of the motion. Do you wish to speak?
No, thanks, Mr. Mayor.
Are there any further questions or debate? Being none, I'll put the motion. All in favour? Against? Declare that motion carried. We'll move on to the next, which is 10.2, 2023 council meeting schedule, and I'll hand back to Mr. Worthy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The report recommends some ordinary meeting dates for council in the 2023 calendar year, and it also recommends that the December 2022 meeting date be brought forward by 1 week to Wednesday, the 14th of December. The meeting times and scheduling of the Planning, Environment and Development Committee are proposed to remain the same in the meeting calendar in relation to the scheduling. And we're also proposing to recommence holding at least one meeting per year in a village location, which was a practice that council previously had in place, but obviously ceased during the COVID-19 period.
Thank you, Mr. Worthy. I'll now call for elected member to move that recommendation to become a motion. Councillor Hook.
Mr. Mayor, I'd like an amendment to the motion.
What would that be?
When it comes to the August meeting 2023, I believe that probably will clash with the dates for AGWIP. And as such, I think we need to move that date to the 23rd.
Okay, so you're moving that motion that the 16th be changed to the 23rd?
And I'm happy to move the motion with that amendment.
To second that.
Councillors, I'll defer to Mr. Stidworthy, but on their website, the dates are still to be determined, and I think the director has information about AGWIP dates in 2023.
Yes, so the inquiries that we've made, our understanding is that they're planning to hold the AGWIP next year a week later. So we've left the date in August at the same timeframe due to that reason. Obviously, if their scheduling changes, we'll have to come back to council to revisit the date. But at this point in time, we understand we won't be clashing.
Then I'm happy to withdraw the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
So are you moving the motion still?
I'd like to move the motion as it stands.
Now call for a seconder to the motion. Thank you. Councillor Hoddle has seconded the motion. Councillor Hook has moved the motion. Do you wish to speak to it?
No, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Do I have an elected member who'd like to speak against this motion or ask a question? Councillor Hoddle has a seconder to the motion. Do you wish to speak to it?
No, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Being no further business, then I'll put this motion. All in favour? Against? Declare the motion carried. Moving on, item 10.3, Rural Fire Service Asset Update for the financial year ending 30th of June 2022. I'll hand back to Mr. Stidworthy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Some of this material was the subject of a council workshop recently. The report's just formalising that information. provides background on the Rural Fire Service and its relationship with New South Wales local government. And it also provides a summary of the required accounting treatment for Rural Fire Service assets for the year ended 30 June 2022, as advised by the New South Wales Auditor General. In response to the advice from the Auditor General, Council has undertaken an assessment of the control requirements and has concluded that it does control the Rural Fire Service assets and should undertake the required accounting recognition accordingly for the year ended 30 June 2022. The report recommends that Council note a stock take was undertaken of Rural Fire Service assets and that Council will recognise the Rural Fire Service assets as non-current assets for the year ending 30 June 2022 in line with the advice from the New South Wales Auditor General.
Thank you. I'll now call for elected member to move a recommendation. Councillor Luke has moved and seconded by Councillor Moses. Councillor Luke, as the mover of the motion, do you wish to speak to it?
No, thank you, Mr Mayor.
I have elected member who'd like to speak against this motion or ask a question. Councillor Moses, second of the motion. Do you wish to speak?
No, thank you, Mr Mayor.
There's no further debate or questions, councillors. I'm going to put this motion. All in favour? Against? Declare that carried. Now moving on to item 10.4, 2022-23 financial assistance grants allocation. I'll hand back to Ms Stidbergen.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. This report recommends that Council note the advice regarding the 2022-23 estimated financial assistance grant allocation for Gunnedah Shire Council. The estimate advised is $5.3 million in total, which is around 4.8% higher than the 2021-22 grant allocation. The report also notes that councils are able to make special submissions to the Grants Commission if they feel that the current grant allocation methodology does not reflect their individual circumstances. And submissions will be accepted up until 30th of June 2022, and they would be effective for the 23-24 financial year if accepted. The information from the Grants Commission was requested to be tabled to Council just so that there is information publicly available around the grant allocation for Council.
Thank you. I'll now call for a mover of the recommendation to become the motion. Councillor Luke, seconded by Councillor Hoddle. Councillor Luke, as the mover of the motion, do you wish to speak to it?
No, thank you, Mr Mayor. Nice to see, though, that the inflation is actually sort of, moving into that particular grant as well, because we certainly need it.
Now call for elected member who'd like to ask a question or speak against this motion. Councillor Hoddle, as a seconder to the motion, you wish to speak?
No, thanks, Mr Mayor.
Just before I put this motion, I'd just like to state how important this grant funding is to the Gunnedah Shire Council, more than $5 million that comes annually. It's just been increased slightly this year to do with CPI, but we can't understate the importance and the fact that we as a group of elected members need to continue to fight through all of our peak bodies, whether it be LG New South Wales, Country Mayors Association, ALGWA, all of our peak bodies in local government to make sure that the federal government stay committed to funding local government to support us specifically around our unsealed road networks. In saying that, I'd now like to put this motion. All in favour? Against? Declare the motion carried. Moving on to item 10.5, Code of Meeting Practice, and I'll hand back to Ms Stidbergen.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. This report recommends that Council endorse an updated Code of Meeting Practice for the purpose of public exhibition and adopt the Code of Meeting Practice if no submissions are received during the submission period. A new model Code of Meeting Practice was released by the Office of Local Government in November 2021. The main changes reflect amendments to the Local Government General Regulation 2021 and Meeting Practice resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic. The updates have been incorporated into Council's Code of Meeting Practice. Following some feedback from Council this afternoon, also in relation to the draft document, we would also propose a slight change to clause 14.2 in the document to go out on public exhibition. And that would be adding a sentence at the end of the current paragraph, which states, and this relates to the audio-visual attendance by councillors. A councillor attending a meeting by audio-visual link must provide a written declaration confirming same at the end of the meeting. The context of that is just in relation to attendance at council meetings where the meeting is then subsequently closed and ensuring that there is no access there is no, other members of the, who aren't part of council attending that aspect of the meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Worthy. I'll now call for elected member. Thank you, councillor MacArthur, and councillor Hook is seconding that motion. Councillor MacArthur is the mover. Do you wish to speak?
No, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Do you have an elected member who'd like to speak against this motion or ask a question? Councillor Hook as a seconder of the motion. Do you wish to speak to it?
Only briefly, thank you, Mr. Mayor. It's good to see that this meeting code of practice has taken us well into the 22nd century, and with the addition of electronic media and the recording practices. And I think the officer's recommendation on the last point is very, very worthy of being included. Thank you.
There are no further questions or debate, councillors. I'll put this motion. All in favour? Against? Declare that carried. Item 10.6, which is policy, councillor and staff interaction. I'll hand back to Mr. Worthy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This report recommends that council endorse an updated councillor and staff interaction policy for the purposes of public exhibition and adopt the policy if no submissions are received during the submission period. Earlier this year, the Office of Local Government released a model policy that provides directions on interactions between councillors and staff to assist both parties in carrying out their day-to-day duties professionally, ethically and respectfully. The policy reinforces the statutory role of councillors as being to set the strategic direction for the council, and the role of staff being to advise the governing body, implement council's decisions, and to oversee service delivery under the leadership of the General Manager. Following some late feedback today in relation to the policy, we would just also propose in relation to the policy that goes out on public exhibition that at the end of clause 10.6 in relation to complaints under the policy being made to the General Manager, that we just add the words in writing at the end of that paragraph. Thank you.
I'll now call for an elected member to move the motion. Thank you, councillor Hoddle, seconded by councillor Moses. Councillor Hoddle, as the mover of the motion, do you wish to speak to it?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, councillors have gone over this pretty carefully. And really what it contains is probably what the law is anyway. So it's putting it down there for this council and future councils as a code of conduct, and I recommend it. Thank you.
Now call for an elected member to speak against the motion or ask a question. Councillor Moses is a seconder of the motion. Do you wish to speak to it?
No, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Therefore, I'll put the motion. All in favour? Against? Declare the motion carried. Moving on, item 10.7, policy, councillor expenses and facilities. And I'll hand back to Mr. Worthy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This report recommends that council endorse an updated councillor expenses and facilities policy for the purpose of public exhibition and adopt the policy if no submissions are received during the submission period. It's a requirement of the Act that council reviews this policy within the first 12 months of each term of council. Council's policy has been updated to align with the Office of Local Government's better practice councillor expenses and facilities policy template. And that template is consistent with the Act regulation and guidelines. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll now call for elected member to move the motion. Thank you, councillor Fuller, seconded by councillor McGrath. Is that your hand? It is? Yep. So councillor McGrath has seconded and councillor Fuller has moved. Councillor Fuller, to move the motion, do you wish to speak to it?
No, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Have elected member who'd like to speak against this motion or ask a question? Councillor McGrath, as a seconder of the motion, do you wish to speak to it?
No, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
That'll be the case then. I'll put this motion. All in favour? Against? Clear that carried. Moving on, item 10.8, policy on investments, and I'll hand back to Mr. Worthy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This report recommends that council endorse an updated investments policy for the purpose of public exhibition and adopt the policy if no submissions are received during the submission period. The draft policy has been developed in accordance with the investment policy guidelines published by the Office of Local Government, and it also complies with the requirements of New South Wales Treasury Corporation. Thank you.
I'll call for elected member to move this motion. Thank you, councillor MacArthur, and seconded by councillor Moses. Councillor MacArthur, as the mover of the motion, do you wish to speak to it?
No need, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Now call for elected member who'd like to speak against this motion or ask a question. Councillor Moses, as a seconder to the motion, do you wish to speak to it?
No, thank you, Mr Mayor.
That'd be the case then. I'll put the motion. All in favour? Against? Declare the motion carried. And 10.9 is next, investments. And I'll hand back to Ms Didworthy.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. The report recommends that council receive and note the report on investments to 31 July 2022. It also notes that $92 million was held in various cash and investments accounts at 31 July, and that the overall investment portfolio complies with council's investment policy parameters.
Thank you. I now call for elected member to move that recommendation. Councillor MacArthur, and Councillor Fuller has seconded the motion. Councillor MacArthur, do you wish to speak to it?
And to thank council staff for taking good care of our investments.
I now call for elected member who'd like to speak against this motion or ask a question. Are there any questions? Councillor Fuller has seconded the motion. Do you wish to speak?
No, thanks, Mr Mayor, but congratulations to everyone again.
I'll now put the motion. All in favour? Against? Declare the motion carried. And our last report for the month of August from Mr Didworthy is item 10.10, outstanding resolution register, and I'll hand back to you.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. This report provides the updated list of outstanding council resolutions for information. Around 36 council resolutions are in progress as detailed in the report attachment. And the council resolutions finalised since the last meeting are also included in the report attachment for information.
Now call for elected member to move the motion that the information be received and noted. Thank you, Councillor Luke, and seconded by Councillor Moses. Councillor Luke, as that mover of that motion, do you wish to speak to it?
No, thank you, Mr Mayor.
Do I have an elected member who'd like to ask a question in relation to any of the items on the resolution register?
I do have a quick question. Sorry, I can't see if anyone else has raised their hand.
Yeah, please go, Councillor McGrath.
So on page 55, the code's 21.07/22, the Gunnedah Motorcycle Club Australian track titles. Can the relevant director just confirm that number 4, the council consider the future of the track within the arena through the showground master plan process? That is now the only aspect of that resolution that will continue. Is that correct?
Thank you, Councillor McGrath, for the question, and through you, Mr Mayor. Yes, that's correct. Item number 4 still stands and continues.
Excellent. Thank you.
Councillor Moses, as the seconder to the motion, do you wish to speak to it?
No, thank you, Mr Mayor.
Are there any further questions or comments, councillors, before I put this motion? Being none, I'll put the motion. All in favour? Against? Declare that motion carried. Thank you, Mr Didworthy. We'll now move on to the Director of Planning and Environment reports, starting with item 11.1, which is Access Working Group nominations, and I'll hand to Mr Johns.
Thanks, Mr Mayor, and through you, councillors, this report, as you would have read, seeks endorsement of Lisa Warren as a community representative on the Access Working Group.
Mr Mayor, I'd like to move that motion, but also could we take items 11.1, 2, 3 and 4 and treat them in globo?
Maybe 1, 2 and 3 are all about nominations. Councillor, did you want to add 4 in, which is a terms of reference
Oh, sorry,
to a working group?
I do apologise. Yes, 1, 2 and 3.
So in globo, 1, 2 and 3. Councillors, before I call for a seconder, is there a reason that we shouldn't determine these 3 items together? Is there an elected member who'd like to speak to any of these individually? No? Well, then I'll call for a seconder to that motion from Councillor Hook. Thank you, Councillor Fuller. So Councillor Hook has moved that in globo, items 11, 1, 2 and 3 are dealt together, and Councillor Fuller has seconded that motion. Councillor Hook is the mover of the motion. You wish to speak to it?
Maybe the director would like to talk about the other 2 before we put the motion.
Thanks, Councillor Hook. I believe the reports speak for themselves. All 3 working groups have solid community representation proposed, so I'd endorse the report and their nominations.
Then, Mr Mayor, I'd just like to endorse the recommendations from the director. Thank you.
I have an elected member who'd like to speak against the motion? Councillor Fuller, as a seconder to the motion, do you wish to speak?
I'd just like to congratulate the people that have put their hand up because it's extremely hard to get people to take on positions. So congratulations to all those people that put their hand up to be on these committees. Thank you.
Councillors, are there any further questions, comments before I put this motion? Being none, I'll put the motion. All in favour? Against? Declare that motion carried. We'll now move on to item 11.4, which is Reconciliation Action Plan Working Group Terms of Reference, and I'll hand back to Mr. Johns to detail the report.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor, and through you, councillors. This report seeks endorsement of the terms of reference of the Reconciliation Action Working Group that have been drafted by the working group.
Thank you, Mr. Johns. I'll now call for elected member to move the recommendation to become the motion. Thank you, Councillor McGrath, and seconded by Councillor Luke. Councillor McGrath has moved the motion and also on that working group. Do you wish to speak to the motion?
And then to thank Mr. Johns and Ms. Deborah Hilton for all the hard work that they've put in getting to this point. Thank you.
Thank you. Do I have an elected member who'd like to speak against this motion or ask a question? Councillor Luke, as a seconder of the motion, do you wish to speak?
No, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Be the case, I'll put the motion now. All in favour? Against? Declare the motion carried. Moving on, item 11.5, budget ratification on grant expenditure allocation. I'll hand back to Mr. Johns.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor, and through you, councillors. This report seeks to have council endorse the budget allocation of $239,651, which essentially fully funds the events that are listed within the report. And that money has come from the Reconnecting Regional New South Wales Community Events Program. The beauty of this report and this funding allocation, councillors, is that that money that we've already allocated out of general fund towards those 6 events are now funded by this grant, which means that any residual funds there can go back into general fund. So it's a very positive story and a $240,000, approximately $240,000 fillip for our economy.
Thank you, Mr. Johns. I now call for elected member. Councillor MacArthur has moved the recommendation to become a motion and seconded by Councillor Moses. Councillor MacArthur has moved the motion. Used to speak to it.
Only to say it's great to see some community events supported. Thank you.
Do I have an elected member who'd like to speak against or ask a question? Councillor Fuller.
Just a question. The conference for our crime prevention, any money for that one or not? I don't see it there, but.
Thanks for the question, Councillor Fuller, and through you, Mr. Mayor. That wouldn't be reconnecting a local community. That would be bringing people in from out of town into town, so it wouldn't be applicable or wouldn't be relevant to that grant program.
Another question. The Harvest Festival, what money was left in that balance of that Harvest Festival?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, and thanks for the question. I'll have to take that on notice, Councillor Fuller.
Councillor Moses is a seconder of the motion. Do you wish to speak to it?
No, thanks, Mr. Mayor.
Are there any further questions or comments, councillors, before I put the motion? Being none, I'll put the motion. All in favour? Against? Declare the motion carried. Next item, we have a declaration of interest from Councillor MacArthur, and I'd just like the record to show that Councillor MacArthur has now left the chambers and will not partake in the conversation or any further determination on this item. So now I'll hand over to Mr. Johns to detail the report and the recommendation of item 11.6, application to modify consent 2013-134.003.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor, and through you, councillors. This report seeks endorsement of a modification to development consent as outlined in the report. It relates to a subdivision of land effectively on Stock Road in Gunnedah. The applicant proposes to reduce the number of stages from 4 to 3 and also the number of lots within those stages. The application is before you as the original application was determined by council previously.
Thank you, Mr. Johns. I'll now call for elected member. Thank you. Councillor Hook has moved the recommendation to become a motion and seconded by Councillor Moses, just snuck in ahead of Councillor Luke. Councillor Hook, do you wish to speak to the motion as the mover?
No, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Do I have an elected member who'd like to speak against this motion or ask a further question? Councillor Moses is a seconder of the motion. Do you wish to speak to it?
No, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
There are no further questions or debate, councillors. I will put this motion. Okay, I'll put the motion. All in favour? Against? I'll declare that motion carried. Can I please request councillor MacArthur to rejoin us? Miss Markey, if I could please ask that you have the record show councillor MacArthur has now rejoined the meeting. And we will move on to the next item, 11.7, application to modify development consent 2012-112. And I'll hand back to Mr. Johns to detail the report and the recommendation.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor and through councillors. This report seeks approval of a DA modification of a proposed outbuilding on Bindia Place, just to the east of town, Gunnedah town that is. The modification seeks to vary the following development standards contained within council's development control plan. First one is it exceeds maximum size of outbuilding by 50 square metres. Proposes to exceed the maximum wall height to the eave line by 300 millimetres. And also exceed the maximum height of an outbuilding by 380 millimetres, which is only very minor. Adjoining owners were notified of the proposed departures to the standards, and we haven't received any objections within the submission period. Given the unique circumstances of the case, I recommend that council approve the variations to the standards.
Thank you, Mr. Johns. I now call for elected member to move. Thank you. Councillor Hook has moved that recommendation to become a motion and seconded by councillor Fuller. Councillor Hook, as a mover of the motion, do you wish to speak to it?
Once again, Mr. Mayor, no, thank you.
I'll now call for elected member who'd like to speak against this motion or ask a question. Councillor Fuller, as a seconder of the motion, do you wish to speak to it?
No, thanks, Mr. Mayor.
If there is no further debate, councillors, I'll put this motion. All in favour? Against? Declare the motion carried. Moving on, item 11.8, which is a Murray-Darling Association 78th Annual Conference, and I'll hand back to Mr. Johns to detail the recommendation.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor, and through you, councillors. As you would have read in this report, it seeks endorsement of councillors Chaffey and Hoddle attending the Murray-Darling Association Conference, which is set down in late September and to be hosted in Albury.
Thank you, Mr. Johns, and I would just clarify the reason for that being that I am the current chair of Region 11 of this organisation. Councillor Hoddle is the alternate delegate to that Murray-Darling Association on behalf of the Gunnedah Shire Council in Region 11. So now I'll call for a mover of the recommendation to become a motion. Councillor Hook once again, and seconded by Councillor Luke. Councillor Hook, as a mover of the motion, do you wish to speak?
No, I don't think so. I need to commend both of you because it's a very, very big position. And I think we've got two very learned people going down there representing this particular area. And I commend you for taking the time, and I wish you well, and looking forward to the report that comes back.
I'll now call for elected member who'd like to speak against this motion or ask a question. Councillor Luke is the second of the motion. Used to speak to it.
I was thinking about making some quip about being learned, but perhaps I'm just learned enough to actually second the motion. So have a nice conference down there.
Are there any further questions or debate? Being none, I'll put the motion. All in favour? Against? Declare that motion carried. Next item is item 11.9, Community Resilience Program Final Report, and I'll hand back to Mr. Johns to detail the recommendation.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor, and through you, councillors. This report simply provides the Community Resilience Program final report for the information of councillors.
Thank you, Mr. Johns. Call for a mover of the recommendation to become the motion. Councillor Luke has moved and Councillor MacArthur has seconded that motion. Councillor Luke has moved the motion. You wish to speak to it.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And it's a very pleasing to actually sort of see such a lovely report come out of all the work that was put in by councillor staff and councillors. So it's nice to see and read again all the things that were actually done. So I commend especially the council staff for this community resilience program.
I'll now call for elected member who'd like to speak against the motion or ask a question. Councillor MacArthur is the second of the motion. Do you wish to speak to it?
Only to endorse councillor Luke's comments.
There are no further debate or questions, councillors. I'm going to put this motion. All in favour? Against? Declare the motion carried. Thank you, Mr. Johns, for your contribution. Moving on, item 12, Director of Infrastructure Services reports. And I'll call on Mr. Bartlett to detail his recommendations, starting with item 12.1, Showground Working Group meeting minutes, 21st of June 2022.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through you. The purpose of this report is for information sharing and acknowledgement of the Showground Working Group meeting minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Bartlett. I'll call for elected member to move the recommendation become the motion. Councillor Hoddle has moved and seconded by Councillor Hook. Councillor Hoddle, do you wish to speak to the motion as a mover?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I was present at the meeting, so it's a true and correct record as I can see. And there's a lot of work to be done there, and it's good. Thank you, Mr. Bartlett, for getting this committee up and running again. And I hope we can do good things. Thank you.
I call for elected member who'd like to ask a question or speak against the motion. Councillor Fuller.
Just that's the only report in there. When we had a whole heap of other committees, I just find that it's a different situation that we've always worked under, that this one's come in and none of the other committees that we've done for the month.
Mr. Mayor and Councillor Fuller, thank you for the observation. There was a question taken on notice at workshops this afternoon in relation to the same matter. The situation with working groups is the minutes aren't by nature brought back to council for adoption. The matters aren't required to be considered by council, with the exception that an officer may bring a report to council. And that normally happens with our working groups, where a matter is considered a working group that requires resolution of council to carry that matter out. However, it is within scope for minutes to be brought back to council at the request of either the council, or if the officer deems that there's a benefit in doing so. So there's certainly the ability to do it, but it's normally brought to council by an officer's report.
Councillor Hook, as a seconder to the motion, do you wish to speak to it?
Only just sort of an observation, and it's been quite some time since that Showground Working Group has actually been active again, and I think it was a really good move on behalf of Mr. Bartlett to bring this report to council to really reinvigorate council's knowledge of this particular working group working again. It certainly surprised a lot of us that it came forward, but I think it was a very, very good outcome that we actually, and the public get to see that this working group is now active once more. So I'm happy to second the motion.
I'll now call for elected member who'd like to speak against this motion or ask a further question. Being none, I'll put the motion. All in favour? Against? Declare the motion carried. Moving on. Item 12.2, draft policy, leasing and licensing council owned and managed land and property. And I'll hand back to Mr. Bartlett to detail the recommendation.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through you, the purpose of this report is to seek approval to exhibit and adopt the leasing and licensing council owned and managed land and property policy, should there be no submissions received within that period.
Thank you, Mr. Bartlett. Now call for elected member to move the recommendation become the motion. Thank you, Councillor MacArthur, seconded by Councillor Moses. Councillor MacArthur, do you wish to speak to it as the mover?
No, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Have elected member who'd like to ask a question or speak against this motion?
Can I ask Mr. Bartlett
You may.
a question? With the leasing and licensing council owned and managed land and property, is there a list there of what land it is and who's leasing and licensed to use it?
Thank you, Councillor Hoddle, for the question, and through you, Mr. Mayor. Council does keep a register of land owned by council and leased and licensed, and including when those leases are up for renewal. But it's not included in this report, if that's what your question is.
Councillor Moses, as a seconder to this motion, do you wish to speak to it?
No, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Have elected member who'd like to ask a further question before I put the motion or ask or speak against the motion? No? Well, then I'll put the motion. All in favour? Against? Declare that motion carried. Next item, we have a declaration of interest from Councillor Hook. in relation to item 12.3, request fee waiver for riding for the disabled. And Ms Markey, if I could have you please record on the minutes that councillor Hook has now left the chambers. And I'll hand over to Mr Bartlett to detail the recommendation.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and through you. The purpose of this report is to seek council's approval to waive the fees associated with riding for disabled Gunnedar's licence over part of Gunnedah Showground for the period of the new agreement being from the 1st of July 22 through till the 30th of June 2027.
Thank you, Mr Bartlett. I'll now call for an elected member to move the recommendation become a motion. Thank you, councillor MacArthur, and seconded by councillor Luke. Councillor MacArthur is the mover of the motion. Do you wish to speak to that?
No, thank you, Mr Mayor. I think it speaks for itself.
I'll now call for elected member who'd like to speak against this motion or ask a question. Being no questions or councillor to speak against it, I'll now, councillor Luke, as the second of the motion, you want to speak to the motion?
No, thank you, Mr Mayor.
Well, if there's no further debate, councillors, I'm going to put this motion. All in favour? Against? Declare the motion carried. I'll now request councillor O'Keefe, maybe if you could open the door and ask councillor Hook if he'd please join us once more. Miss Markey, can I please ask you to have the record show councillor Hook has rejoined the ordinary meeting for August and is now in attendance. We'll now move on to item 12.4, proposed transfer of land, Watertower Museum, lot 21, DP 929163, and I'll hand back to Mr Bartlett to detail the report and his recommendation.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and through you. The purpose of this report is to inform councillors of the formalisation of the transfer of ownership of land being lot 21 on DP 929162 from the Minister of Public Works to Gunnedah Shire Council. It's a for information report only and an administrative formality. Advice has been received from the Office of the Minister that the transfer will occur even if it is declined by council.
Thank you, Mr Bartlett, for that great news. I'll now call for an elected member to please move that motion. Councillor Luke's moved and councillor Moses has seconded the motion. Councillor Luke, do you wish to speak to the motion as the mover of the motion?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. It's interesting how slowly some parts of government move, isn't it? 1968, how many years is that? It's nice to know that this has been finalised. There's a lot of hard-working volunteers in the that inhabit the building on this particular lot, which is the Water Tower Museum. And there has been some insecurity or difficulties in their ability to access grant funding. So it's good that this is becoming resolved, this issue. I would also, if I may, please ask a question of the director, whether there is, that also means that that the building on the land, which is the Water Tower Museum, whether that now is part of the control of council.
Thank you, councillor Luke, for the question, and through you, Mr Mayor. Yes, that's the effect of the transfer.
Thank you.
Now call for elected member who'd like to ask a further question or speak against the motion. Councillor Moses, as a seconder of the motion, do you wish to speak?
No, thank you, Mr Mayor.
Being the case, then I'll put this motion. All in favour? Unanimously supported. Moving on, item 12.5, 2022 National Local Roads and Transport Congress, and I'll hand back to Mr Bartlett to detail the report and the recommendation.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and through you. The purpose of this report is to inform councillors of the 2022 Australian Local Government Association National Local Roads and Transport Congress to be held at the Rest Point Complex, Hobart, Tasmania, on the 2nd and 3rd of November 2022, and to ascertain council's attendance.
Thank you, Mr Bartlett. Before we continue on, I'd like to call for nominations for this position. Councillor Hook.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I'd like to nominate councillor Hoddle for the position.
Councillor Hoddle, do you accept the nomination? I'll now call for further nominations. Councillor Luke.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I'd like to nominate myself to be an alternate to councillor Hoddle. He's extremely keen on this, as am I. having attended the New South Wales Local Roads Congress. So I'd like to have an alternate listed in there as well, which is myself.
Thank you, councillor Luke, and I'm sure you'll accept. I'll now ask for any further nominations. I'll call for any further nominations. Being no further nominations, I'll now put to the council the opportunity for 2 delegates to go to this conference. I will request firstly from the general manager whether we have current budget at the moment for such an allocation of 2 people to this conference.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As I think we've discussed previously, there's an allocation there, not specific to conferences, but generally, and certainly at this point, there would be sufficient funds to send a second delegate if council so chooses. I note that roads is the largest asset category within our balance sheet, and activity which councillor Hoddle's already referred to causes much interest within the community. So if there's something that merits more than one attendee, this may well be one of those such items, councillors.
So councillors, I put to you 2 names and we have had both of the councillors accept nominations. So I will now call for a mover of the recommendation as you see before you. Councillor MacArthur has moved the motion and Councillor Hook has seconded the motion. Councillor MacArthur, as the mover of the motion, used to speak.
I'm looking forward to a successful conference for you and ways in which we can perhaps seek increased funding to achieve what we want to and need to achieve in the Shire. Thank you.
I'll now call for elected member who'd like to speak against this motion. Councillor Hook has seconded the motion. Do you wish to speak to it?
I need to endorse what councillor MacArthur said, and I think being such a large asset base for our Shire, I think it's important that the conference is well represented from this area.
Are there any further questions or debate, councillors, before I put this motion? Being none, I'll put the motion. All in favour? Against? Declare the motion carried. Thank you, Mr. Bartlett, for your contribution. Now move on to item 13, which is reports to committees. We have 13.1 Audit and Risk Improvement Committee meeting minutes that were held on the 21st of July 2022. Councillors, I'll call on an elected member to move the recommendations. I'll be true and correct. Thank you, Councillor MacArthur, and seconded by Councillor Luke. Councillor MacArthur has moved the motion. Do you wish to speak to it?
No, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
I'll call on an elected member who'd like to ask a question or speak against the motion. Being none, Councillor Luke, as a second of the motion, do you wish to speak?
No, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Then I'll put the motion. All in favour? Against? Declare that motion carried. Next, which we have is item 14, delegates' reports. We have 2022 New South Wales Local Roads Congress, June 2022. We have a report by Councillor Luke, who I'm sure would like to move this motion. I'll give an opportunity very shortly to Councillor Luke to speak to it. I'll call for a seconder to the motion. Thank you, Councillor Hook. Councillor Luke, do you wish to speak to this motion?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It certainly is a very important part of our of the work that we actually do in our budget for this local government area. I did find that the Congress was well run, succinct and to the point, as are our engineers who actually sort of sit in these positions with infrastructure. Interesting to note that one of the chaps that I met down there was the pavement manager for Liverpool Council. So it's interesting to note that some of these larger councils, there's just one bod in charge of pavements, a real eye-opener, but very well run. At the end of the, or a couple of weeks after the Congress, a communique is put out for all those delegates who attended, and it's a really good way of summarising what was determined during that Congress. And I have included that in my report. So I recommend my report to my fellow councillors. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Luke. I'll now ask fellow elected members if there are any questions of Councillor Luke. No questions. Councillor Hook is the second of the motion. Do you wish to speak to it?
No, thank you, Mr Mayor.
Then I'll put the motion. All in favour? Against? Declare that motion carried. There are no questions, notice of motions or question on notice. So we come now to closed meeting. We have a late report. So I will ask the question. Is there any reason why anyone believes the agendaed item should not be determined in closed meeting? Speak now. No. Well, then I'll request from an elected member that they move the motion that we move into closed meeting to discuss this item. Thank you, Councillor Moses, and